So, you're interested in a retro Corvette, something a few decades old with style and performance that won't break the bank. But which generation is best, C4, C5, or C6? In this video, I've gathered all three for the world's first in-depth comparison test, zeroing in on the stuff that you probably won't notice until after you've actually lived with these cars like I have. So let's uncover the surprising things that rock and kinda suck with each version of America's sports car. Welcome to Retro Cars Forever, where we celebrate cars of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. My name is Brad, and I'm excited to bring you this deep dive comparison test between three of my all-time favorite cars. I'm a previous owner of a C4, I spent 4 great years with this 1996 collector edition, and I'm a current owner of this blue 2007 C6. While I have yet to own a C5, I've driven several examples throughout the decades. I even used to wheel them around when they were brand new, back when I worked as a lot attendant at our local dealer. Shout out to Bob Brown Chevrolet in Urbandale, Iowa. Nowadays, these three generations of Corvette are often cross-shopped between each other. I know I certainly have. All three can be driven every day, all three are performance car bargains, and all three have depreciated to a similar price point. But which retro Vette is best for you? Let's start with the most important difference between these three: what's under the skin. The C4 debuted in 1984 and had a backbone chassis that was unfortunately compromised right from the start. It was originally designed to have removable T-tops just like the C3 had, but at the last minute, a GM executive decreed that the C4 would have a fully removable targa top instead. So the crucial bar connecting the top of the B-pillar to the top of the windshield frame was suddenly removed, reducing structural integrity to that of approximately a wet noodle. Engineers did what they could to shore up the structure, which meant raising the side sills and making the removable top panel a load-bearing element. More on that later. While the C4 structure was reasonably stiff for its day, by the end of its long run in 1996, it was clear that the next Corvette needed more backbone to stand up to the competition. So when the C5 premiered in 1997, it had a radically different platform. Instead of assembling the side rails out of separately welded pieces like they did in the C4, the new side rails of the C5 were much stronger single units, incorporating an advanced hydroforming procedure. For additional strength, more interior room, and to achieve a perfect 50-50 weight distribution balance, the transmission was removed from the traditional location of right behind the engine to the back of the car, directly in front of the rear differential. A central tunnel, called a torque tube, was introduced to connect the two ends of the driveline together. The C5 ended up with a structure that was an astounding 4.5 times stiffer than the C4's, which to my knowledge is the biggest jump up in structural stiffness in all of automotive history. Next up was the C6, which debuted in 2005, but it was more of an evolution from the previous generation than a revolution. The basic mechanical layout stayed the same, and around 30% of the parts carried directly over from the C5. In fact, the two gens are so mechanically similar that my Chilton repair manual covers both the C5 and the C6. So that makes the C4 the odd man out in this test. But even though it looks like the basic platform puts the oldest Corvette at a massive disadvantage, there's still a lot to love about the C4. The C4 is the only Corvette with a full clamshell hood, which includes the fenders. It's not only a cool flex, it also gives you the best access to the C4's engine and front suspension. On top of that, you don't have to worry about scratching the fenders when leaning over like you do in the later cars. Another bonus with the C4 Coupe is the handy integrated cargo cover that can be rolled in or out in just a few seconds. The C5 and 6 also have cargo covers, but they're much fussier to take on or off as it's a completely separate piece that is attached with a series of loops. Nowhere near as slick. Something you'll notice right away living with these three cars is how much worse the lower front air dams of the C5 and C6 scrape against curbs or inclines. I'll use this Pepsi can for a reference as these three cars all have stock ride heights. You can see just how little clearance there is with the C6 and the C5 as well. And you can see how the C4 sits a few valuable inches higher, meaning it's much less likely to scrape on inclines. Wait a minute, Pepsi and the C4 Corvette. Where have I seen that combo before?
Pepsi Cola Cara big chance! この絞れコルベットが当たります!
Huh, that was weird. Where was I? While the C5 and C6's front air dam skirts are made of a softer, flexible material that's designed to give, it's still embarrassing how often they can noisily drag against even the slightest bit of curbing that a C4 would easily clear. Maybe the biggest thing the C4 has going for it is how easy the conventional layout makes servicing the car. For example, changing the clutch in a C5 or C6 is a daunting task as you have to drop the entire torque tube assembly just to get to it. In fact, in the C5 and 6, there's several items that require removing the torque tube to access, which requires removing the exhaust system, most of the rear suspension, heat shields, and the transaxle. Good luck if you don't have a lift. Also, if there's ever any issues with the C4's gas tank, it's easy to access in the back of the car. It's one of the few cars where the fuel pump can be replaced without even removing the tank. It just lifts right out the top. The C5 and C6 have much more complicated saddle tanks buried deep within the car, with an additional pump added just to get gas from one side to the other, so it's a much bigger pain to fix. Speaking of fuel, the C4 has a centrally located fuel filler, so if the pumps are crowded, you can pick whatever side of the gas station is the most convenient. With the C5 and 6, you gotta position yourself to use the driver's side only. And if you have the need for speed like I do, then you'll love how the C4 seats keep you locked firmly in place. The C4 side bolstering is easily the most aggressive of this trio. It's even better if your C4 has the optional sports seats. With their power adjustable side bolsters that give you a nice bear hug to keep you from sliding around in turns. The adjustable side bolsters in the C5 and C6 are much gentler by comparison. Adding to the C4's driving fun is how raw and unfiltered it feels. All of these Vettes are a blast to drive, but the C4 has the most honest and direct mechanical connection that's bliss for anyone who loves helming old school machinery. And the C4 is the unbeatable nostalgia machine. The aesthetic inside and out is a throwback to a bygone era. So if you want to feel like you've traveled back in time every time you go for a spin, the C4 is the best of the bunch. And the final C4 Plus is the cheapest of the three cars here to purchase. A good example of a base C4 goes for between 8 to 20 grand, with later cars being worth more. But feel free to check out my C4 buyer's guide here for more precise values with options. Alright, let's discuss the downsides of C4 ownership, and a lot of this is going to come down to that compromised platform I mentioned earlier. The basic structure is only 1/4 as stiff as the C5 or C6, which wreaks havoc on the suspension tuning of the C4. There's a lot more deflection around bumpy turns, making the car feel more skittish, nervous, and unpredictable in fast driving on uneven surfaces. To keep that monkey motion under some sort of control, the engineers made the sport suspension tuning much stiffer, so that means the C4 doesn't ride as well either. The double whammy of worse handling and a harsher ride. That loosey-goosey C4 platform also means there's more wiggle room for squeaks and rattles to escape, especially in earlier model years. As I mentioned earlier, the C4 Coupe's target top bears a lot of the structural load, so you gotta use this wrench tool to remove it. It's a much more laborious procedure than the others, as the C4 requires wrenching out 4 bolts, and takes around 4 minutes to remove and stow in the back. In the C5 and C6, the stiffer undercarriage means the top is less critical to the structure of the car, so the target releases with just 3 easy latches and can be removed and stowed in less than a minute. It doesn't help that the C4's target top is about 10 pounds heavier than the C5 or C6 Targas, which use lighter magnesium frames. 10 pounds might not seem like a lot, but you'll definitely notice the difference when leveraging the funky angles required to take the top on or off. And as I found out with my own C4, once the top is removed, the weaker structure becomes even more apparent with noticeably worse cowl shake and body flex. The tall side sills of the C4 are a literal pain every time you have to get in or out. The C5 and C6 have sills that are around 4 inches lower, which is a huge relief. Not helping the entry and exit of the C4 is how cramped the footwells are, especially on the passenger side. The transmission tunnel crowds a ton of space, which isn't an issue on the C5 or C6 like you see here, where the transmission was moved to the back, leaving way more room for your little piggies. The entire C4 interior is much more crowded than the others, so if you shop at the big and tall store, you're probably better off with the roomier interiors of the later Vettes. You'll get way less trunk space in the C4 as well. To be fair, 13 cubic feet isn't bad for a sports car, but that's only around half of what you get in the incredibly generous trunks of the C5 or C6 coupes. And if you get a C4 convertible, the trunk situation is even worse because, well, there really isn't one. Just this small storage area behind the seats, just big enough for a few briefcases. Compare this to the C5 or C6 convertibles, which got dedicated trunks that were some of the roomiest in the convertible class. Now let's talk engines. The C4's base power output, which grew over time, is still the weakest of the group. Each new Corvette engine design added roughly 50 more horsepower. Considering all these cars weigh about the same, at roughly 3,200 pounds, that's a noticeable boost in performance the later you go. And despite the added power, gas mileage also went up thanks to advancements in fuel injection and computer controls. Speaking of performance, the C4's brakes fall short of the others. The brake pedal feel of the C4 is wooden and vague, and much less confidence-inspiring than the later generations. The C4 also lacks dedicated brake cooling ducts that bless the C5 and C6 that channel cool air directly onto the brakes. Another nice feature to have in the Canyons is active handling, which was introduced in the C5 and standard on the C6. Active handling is an added measure of stability control, which employs individual brakes to help guide the Corvette on its intended path when the car starts to veer out of control. You can even adjust how much active handling computer guidance you want, including turning it fully off. Active handling is a nice safety net to have and is not available on any C4. Another high-tech feature available in the C5 and C6, but not in the C4, is the heads-up windshield display. It's one of those gadgets that sounds totally unnecessary at first until you actually have it, and then you won't want to live without it. If your Corvette driving duties are split between 2 people, you'll want a C5 or C6 with optional memory controls. This allows power-adjustable settings for the seats, mirrors, the radio presets, and the available telescoping steering wheel to be set and easily recalled with the push of a single button. Unfortunately, memory settings were not offered on any C4. A C4 secret quirk is the annoying seatbelt cinching system. Hit the brakes in the C4 and the seatbelt automatically restrains you in place, which is pretty typical. But what isn't typical is that afterwards, unlike normal cars, it won't let up the slack, restraining you in place. The only way to reset the belt is to unlatch it and latch it again, which gets really tiresome over time. Gotta mention the C4's awful steering column stock, which came right from the bottom of the GM bargain parts bin. It not only feels as fragile as the stem of a delicate wine glass, there's way too many functions crammed onto just one unit. The C5 and C6 spread out these controls much better by adding an additional stock just for the wiper controls, and the stocks don't feel nearly as brittle. As far as reliability goes, I'd say these 3 retro Vettes are roughly equal. Yeah, they each have their own unique and annoying idiosyncrasies, but earlier C4s are generally the most trouble-prone of the lot. That's not only because of sheer age, but also their quirky electrical and computing systems. Check out my C4 buyer's guide for more details, but in general, if you want a C4 that you can depend on every day, like I did, you'll want to focus on the last 3 model years of 94, 95, and especially 1996. Finally, the sightline looking forward in the C4 is the worst of this trio. The viewing angle was improved on the later Vettes, letting you see objects on the ground in front of you 18 feet closer than in the C4. So that's the C4 in a nutshell, but I'll give you my overall thoughts on how it stacks up against the other 2 generations later. Now, let's look at the C4's radical successor, the C5. Pluses of the C5. If cargo space is what you need, this Vette's for you. The hatchback C5 has the biggest trunk of this trio, double the size of the C4 and 3 cubic feet larger than the C6. Even better, it's the only retro Vette with this huge hidden central cubby. But I think the biggest plus of the C5 is how intuitive it is to drive. You can easily hand over the key to any friend, valet, detailer, or mechanic and not sweat that they won't understand any of the odd quirks of the other generations. For example, the C4 has a funky, flyaway emergency brake handle, which most people have zero experience with, if they can even find it. But the C5 has a dead simple e-brake right where you'd expect it to be. With the C6, just getting in confuses people, as there are no obvious door handles but rather these hidden pads. With the C5, you have big, friendly, intuitive handles, just like I think every car should. And the C5 starts with a conventional key. You don't have to bother with the potentially confounding keyless rocker switch system of the C6. In other words, anyone can hop in and drive a C5. It's a straightforward experience that makes you feel instantly at home. Woo. As far as negatives specific to the C5, the biggest is the Rubbermaid look and feel of the interior. While it's very functional and easy to use, it's just not that pleasing to the touch or the eyes, especially in the dull black coloring that most of these had. The seats are also the flattest and least supportive of the group. As far as styling goes, I think all three of these cars look amazing, but I have to single out a styling nitpick of the C5, which is the silly look that the pop-up headlights have when they're up. The angle of the headlight covers makes the C5 look like it has a worried expression, unbecoming of a fun sports car such as this. So that's the C5, let's move on to our final retro Vette, the C6. If you're power hungry, then the C6 is for you. Even the weakest C6 engine, the LS2, will get you a full 400 horsepower and 400 pound-feet of torque right out of the box. And the power only goes up from there to the staggering 638 horsepower of the mighty C6 ZR1. The C6 is the most aerodynamic of the group, allowing not only the highest top speed, but also the least amount of wind noise, making the C6 as quiet as a luxury car at cruising speed. That silence is also thanks to the indexing door glass system, which makes for an ultra-tight window seal, something the C4 and C5 lack. The interior of the C6 is easily the most luxurious of the group. There's a solid attempt at pleasing materials and textures that's a clear cut above the others. And the C6 was the first Corvette offered with heated seats. Another fancy feature missing in the earlier Corvettes is the soft closing trunk mechanism. Honestly, at first I thought this was technological overkill, but I've grown to love it, as it allows a nice gentle closing of the hatch without unseemly slamming. The C6 easily wins the cup holder game. There are 2 cup holders, and both are big enough to be truly usable. The C5 only got 1 cup holder, and it's not that big. While the C4's cup holders are placed too close to the shift lever. Use 6th gear or reverse at your own risk. Now, if you don't want to shift for yourself, the C6 has the best automatic transmission of the bunch, as long as you skip the 2005 model. That first year had a carryover 4-speed, the same amount of gears as the C4 and C5 automatics had. But in 2006 onwards, the C6 got a new 6-speed automatic that also included nifty tap shifters for a dash of manual control. On the safety front, the C6 is the first Corvette to offer side impact airbags, which deploy high enough to protect that all-important noggin. Another safety feature unique in this group are the headlights. While some Corvette fans lament that the C6 did away with pop-up headlights, the C6 was one of the first cars on the market with high-intensity discharge technology. Those lights project an amazingly bright and even lighting pattern that's 66% brighter and 25% more uniform than the C5, and worlds better than what the C4 had. Now for the C6 negatives. Not surprisingly, there's a downside to all those fancy features, as that extra complexity means there's just more things that can eventually go wrong compared to the earlier and simpler Corvettes. Speaking of complexity, I think the electric door handles are technological overkill. I just don't see any benefit to them, and they force the additional complexity of manual backup levers just in case the battery dies and the electric doors stop functioning. So what's the point? Unlike the earlier Vettes, the C6 does not offer an easily accessible fuel filter. It's buried deep inside one of the fuel tanks, and like I said earlier, the fuel tanks themselves are buried deep inside the car. In theory, the fuel filter should last the life of the car, but I sure wish I could easily change mine out like you can with the others, just for peace of mind. If you want a big dose of nostalgic retro flavor, the C6 is going to taste a little bland. Even though the C6 debuted in the mid-2000s, the cutting-edge technology almost makes the C6 feel like any other modern car, and there's the ever-present feeling that the car's computerized brain is constantly monitoring the whole operation. And finally, the C6 is more expensive to purchase compared to a C4 or C5. Nice base C6 Corvettes go for around 14 to 34 grand, which is around 10 grand more than equivalent C4s. You do get a lot more luxury, safety, and performance for that price, but you'll pay for it up front. Conclusion time! Which of these three retro Vettes is the one to get? In my opinion, the C4 is the best of the bunch if you're on a budget. They're the cheapest to purchase, and in most cases, the cheapest and easiest to fix. Also, if you don't drive your Corvette every day and just want an occasional weekend or show car, the C4 gives you the most fun nostalgia for your dollar. Even with its numerous pain points, there's a charm to the C4 that makes you feel special every single time you drive it. The C4 would also be my pick if you want an affordable track rat or drift missile. If you just want a fast car to beat on, fix, and modify yourself, that all plays to the C4's strengths, and the everyday negatives aren't really a factor. However, if you're like me and you want to drive your Corvette every single day, or you want a relaxing road trip vehicle, then the C6 is the clear winner. It's not only the fastest retro Vette, it's also every bit as luxurious as my old Lexus or Infiniti, giving the C6 an unbeatable combo of speed and comfort. But on the flip side, the C6 is the trickiest to maintain and the most expensive to purchase, so make sure you have a healthy savings account before considering one. As for the C5, it could be your Goldilocks Corvette. It lands neatly in the middle of the other two generations when it comes to value, performance, and day-to-day livability. So if you want a mix of old and new, the C5 might be just right. But let's hear from you in the comments below. Any strengths or weaknesses that I didn't mention? And do you have a favorite Corvette generation? Let me know. I read every comment I get, and I love responding to what you have to say. And make sure to check out my other videos that are suggested just for you on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you have a fun car, get out there and drive.